1979. It was described by John Updike in the New Yorker, no less, as, quote, a graceful, touching, ironically titled tale that bears a plain feminist message, unquote. Yet the plain feminist message he speaks of is no more or less than the plain sexist message of some of the aforementioned male counterparts of that era. But let's not go into Samuel Selvon's Moses trilogy. I do wonder, however, why Achebe's Things Fall Apart has become such an iconic text of post-colonial literature when The Joys of Motherhood is such a powerful testament to the endurance of Nigerian women in a traditional but changing society. Reading it gave me a profound imagined insight into my own Nigerian grandmother's life, who died in 1967 and whom I never met. My grandmother lived in Lagos during the same period as Emecheta's protagonist. Like Ego, my grandmother was also a market trader who also suffered the disappointment of marriage, in her case early widowhood, and abandonment by her teenage son, who left for England in 1949 and whom she never saw again, my father. While admiring Things Fall Apart as a seminal text of anti-colonial literature, it does foreground male experience. The Joys of Motherhood foregrounds female experience. Actually, I prefer it. When Achebe died, he was repeatedly described as the founding father of African literature, which is a ridiculous notion. To locate an entire continent's literary origins in a single individual author of any gender, irrespective of the power and reach of their most famous book. In any case, the female-centered narratives of Emecheta's early novels served to counterbalance a literary history that was decidedly male. It is also worth noting that Emecheta's first publisher was Allison and Busby, co-founded in 1967 by a black publishing trailblazer who is still very active on the British literature scene, Margaret Busby. She was instrumental in bringing writers such as Emecheta to prominence and later went on to edit Daughters of Africa, the groundbreaking anthology of black women's writing going all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. It's also worth remembering that once upon a time, Emecheta was a powerful writer taken seriously, the only black writer to make the first Granta Top 20 list in 1983. Who knew that? Today, she has yet to be rediscovered by another generation. Like much of black history, if we don't keep the flame alive, it goes out. By the 1970s, Beryl Gilroy, who had arrived in Britain from Guyana in 1951, published a children's series called Nippers, but didn't start publishing adult novels until the mid-1980s. Petronella Breinberg from Suriname also began publishing children's fiction in the 70s. The first generation, as they're called, writers and artists, shared the experience of immigration to Britain as young adults, and in 1966, Andrew Salkey and others formed a movement, the Caribbean Artist Movement, CAM, where they shared their ideas and creativity with each other and developed an audience for their work. It seems appropriate that many of these novelists who were preoccupied with home and belonging left England for good at some point to relocate abroad. In the end, they were sojourners who did not feel accommodated and eventually took flight. By the 1990s, the better known among them, Braithwaite, Lamming, Salkey and Selvon, had left Britain. By the end of the 80s, two Caribbean-born writers who had grown up in Britain started to publish. Carol Phillips with The Final Passage in 1985, about a couple migrating to Britain from the Caribbean, and Mike Phillips with Blood Rights in 1989, the first of his Sam Dean crime fiction series of 4 London novels, none of which focused on the problems of immigration or assimilation. A generation after CAM, another movement as such came about, one which I was personally involved in. A community of young women of colour emerged who were writing urgently about race, gender, class and sexuality. Feeling excluded from mainstream British society, we redressed our position of invisibility by creating a grassroots feminist culture of cross-art fertilisation that provided a creative space for, by and about black women. Just to say that back then, black women often included all women of colour. In 1982, I had just graduated from drama school with the realisation that plays that reflected my reality as a black and mixed-race British woman did not exist. I had studied